Okay, I think we better start before anybody else comes. Just a quick announcement before we start. I want to invite you all, I guess, from 5 to 7 today over in the Posner Center. It's the opening of an exhibit, Ivan Sutherland's Trojan Cockroach, sort of a very early mobile robot. I read this myself. It was a little bit agitated because I remember I was here when that happened, so I kind of dates myself. But I think it's pretty cool exhibit. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dan Lee as our inaugural speaker for the 2016 edition of our Robotics Seminar. Dan is the UPS Foundation Chair Professor in the School of Engineering at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the director of the GRASP lab there, which we know well. I've actually come to know and work with Dan a little bit more recently through his connection as what would be co-chair of the CMU Penn University Transportation Center. So that's sort of another area. But you all know Dan for his long line of work in autonomous systems, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Can everyone hear me okay if I speak like this? Great. So today I wanted to tell you a little bit about some work on both in the machine learning and thinking about decision making in intelligent systems. And what I wanted to do today was contrast some of our work in robotics with what we know about in terms of human intelligence. So when you think about trying to build intelligence as in engineering or in robotics, we tend to think about building things from a top-down fashion, right? We want to have our robots do some sort of high-level functions. We then break down that task into subtasks. We then build algorithms, think about algorithms for that, and then finally we implement it. Whereas my friends in the biology side, they kind of think more bottom up, right? They're going to look at a brain, they're going to look at kind of the individual neural connections, they're going to think about what types of computations that these little microcircuits may do. Then they try to build up from the microcircuit scale up to larger level circuits, and then what happens across different brain regions, and then finally how that connects to actually the behavior of the animal. So I wanted to talk a little bit about when we break down a robotic system and try to think about what that implies about what we know about the kind of ultimate levels of performance that we might have in animals. Okay? So when we try to do this comparison between synthetic and natural intelligence, one of the simple ways that we have tried to do this in the AI community in the past is to have these kind of contests, competitions between man versus machine. And so a kind of a good example, of course, in the AI community is, Deep Blue and Watson that were built to play chess against humans or to play this Jeopardy game against humans. Now, this, I think, is not quite a fair comparison because if you actually look at how these programs were built, the competitions were rigged in a certain sense, right? So the chess machines were kind of handcrafted with lots of kind of opening stored maneuvers. They were kind of tuned to fight against Garry Kasparov, who was the human player at the time. They analyzed all his previous games. And so they hand-coded in a lot of things that enabled the machine at that time to beat Garry Kasparov. On the other hand, the Jeopardy competition was also rigged, right? The computers at that time did not have to do any sort of speech recognition, did not have to read the words. And the kind of biggest cheat, I don't know if anyone here has actually played Jeopardy, been on the Jeopardy show, but if both contestants actually know the answer, there's a red light in the studio, and you have to wait till this red light in the studio goes off before you hit your clicker, your buzzer, and then the first person to buzz in is able to get the points for that question. Now, they basically had the machine be able to buzz in 1 millisecond after that red light went off. So you can see that already it was rigged on the machine side, just on that kind of low-level motor control rather than at the high-level types of reasoning. All right? Now, more recently, right, we're all familiar here, if you're in the machine learning community, about successes in terms of deep learning types of systems, right, being able to build these large convolutional networks, and in application to, object recognition or having them play Atari video games, and you see now lots of kind of commercial types of interest from the industry side in taking these types of systems and really making them into practical products. Okay? But so this seems to bode well, that we're kind of well on our way to kind of really having very truly intelligent systems. We're going to have all these kinds of commercial successes. But when you look at kind of real robots, when they're really physically embodied in the real world, we have another story. And this is something I'm familiar with because we had a team in the DARPA robotics competition. Our friends, some of my friends from KAIST in Korea were the winners of this competition. But I think the biggest takeaway kind of message and kind of searing image of what happened on that competition is this video that I'm sure some of you have seen. But this was the video that did all the kind of outtakes from this, right? So you see these robots falling over. You see, in this case, this is Chimp here from CMU, right? There was, again, some configuration in their human error there. There's also robots falling on the rubble. Right, just falling, I don't know what the design of this robot was, or something happening to the motor controllers. This is our colleagues at Virginia Tech, falling right at the beginning of that, not being able to open the door properly. And this is Jerry Pratt's group falling off the stairs. Right? This is our friends in Germany, kind of sidestepping, trying to sidestep through the door. This is friends from Robotics in Korea, not making it to the valve here in this case. This is some Japanese robot that's not even grabbing the wheel, right, and torquing itself over, right? And this is just also complete. This is actually our robot, so we weren't immune to this, right? So, falling, getting the drill falling on you. This is MIT's robot when it's coming off the vehicle, right? So you have some Parkinsonian types of symptoms here before it makes a fall. Right, so this kind of just shows you that if you look at these tasks, I think someone did this at the DRC, was if you had a 10-year-old child, the 10-year-old child would have finished this course in about 5 minutes. Okay, so still we have a long ways to go in terms of being able to really program and build these machines at the level of robustness that we take for granted in animal systems. Right? So what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about trying to use machine learning techniques to try to improve these systems. And so what I want to do is first give you a little bit of an overview of what's been done in the learning domain for robots. Then I'm going to give you a set of vignettes in terms of some different application areas that we've looked at in robot systems. And one is to do online learning for vision, for perception. The other one is to do some dimensionality reduction and learning for motion planning. Then also some reinforcement learning for legged locomotion. And then finally, I want to tell you a little bit about some more theoretical analysis in terms of optimal decision making. So I'm going to concentrate on these technical areas to try to give you a flavor of some of the possibilities that I see as doable in kind of the next few years in terms of research in this area. Okay? So when you first think about kind of learning in robotics, kind of the kind of first thing you would think about is, well, what's a robot? It's a bunch of sensors, it's a bunch of actuators. You basically have this robot embedded in some sort of physical environment. And so you might think about learning as just basically taking some inputs from your sensors and then generating some outputs through your actuators, which then goes through your environment through this kind of perception action loop, and basically then just trying to figure out using, say, a neural network or some sort of learning algorithm to kind of feed whatever sensor values to your actuator values. Right? This is the kind of the naive approach that you would take to building a robot that can learn in the environment. And this is an old idea, and it actually was one of the pioneers was here, Dean Pomeroy. As part of NavLab, they made a neural network that basically took in as inputs here a small low-resolution image coming from a camera. And the idea was to use training examples from a human driver as the human driver was steering the car around left or right. And they built a little neural network that learned to associate essentially things like features of the curvature of the road to basically the desired steering angle that the driver was using to kind of keep themselves on the kind of appropriate middle of the road. So that was kind of a nice application of the simple idea to doing, training a robot to do a particular subtask like this. All right? Now the problem though is that this type of general learning approach does not apply more generally to a more complex domain. So the idea would be, would you be able to do this to, say, learn autonomous driving end to end, right? And I think that right now, with our current capabilities, it doesn't look so possible. Now, people are thinking about using deep networks to try to do this task, but the fact that you would have to somehow learn from just observational data all the things like traffic rules, being able to reason about, you know, the structure of the intersections, being able to reason about, you know, the different dynamics and the navigation and how you would have to handle roadblocks just from kind of sensor input in kind of instantaneous fashion seems at this point to be very difficult to do in kind of a tabula rasa way with these robots. So the way we approach it, of course, if you built any of these robotic systems, is we basically break down the problem into these actual hierarchical modules in a robotic system. So for instance, if you're going to do autonomous driving, you would basically take in your external sensor information, either from your cameras, from your LiDAR, from any other types of external sensors. You also have, you know, other sensors like your inertial measurement units, any joint encoders. These are your ego sensors. And then you have your actuators. And instead of trying to directly hook up your sensors directly to your actuators through some amorphous network, you break down your problem into these subtasks, such as, you know, doing localization or doing some sort of state estimation. You know, from your perceptual data, you might want to do some object segmentation, object detection. You might want to do some sort of mapping in either 2, 2.5, or 3 dimensions. And then from there, you want to take these maps and you want to feed them up into some sort of higher level behaviors. And then from here, you're going to feed them into some sort of motion planner. So now you're planning some trajectories. And then these trajectories are then fed to some sort of trajectory following module, which then is going to go to your motor controllers, right? So we have a kind of a nice hierarchical decomposition of this larger goal of autonomous driving into these different modules. And these things then run at the appropriate update rates. And learning algorithms can be then done kind of on a local level rather than on this kind of global tabula rasa type of approach. Okay? So an example of this type of architecture working is our experience with the Urban Challenge, right? This is our car at that time. You know, right, it's driving here at the beginning of the Urban Challenge. This is the grandstand. You see the robot car just kind of driving on its own. It's steering the wheel. It has to take in information from its sensors to kind of map out the ground that it's driving on, all the different objects in the world. In this case, right, the instructions to the cars, they were given some set of sparse GPS waypoints, and then these cars were tasked with routing themselves to different parts of this mock city that DARPA had set up at the time. So you see it's winding its way around these barriers. At this point, there's actually a traffic circle here in the definition in the map, overall map. So it stops on the white line before it enters the traffic circle. It turns on its right turn blinker. It then checks to see if there's any oncoming traffic in the traffic circle, which in this case, there's no incoming traffic. So at this point, it makes a decision to enter this circle. And then the local speed limit now goes up to, I think in this case, about 20, 25 miles per hour. And then it's able to then wind its way around this kind of curved road and then try to pick the appropriate lane as it's going through. All right? So this is the behavior that you're able to generate with this type of modules. And what we try to then do is the way it's generated is we use a kind of an interesting, you know, as a roboticist, we build this kind of interesting probabilistic internal representation to help accomplish this task. In this case, all the sensor information is done to do state estimation, localization. It builds a 2D occupancy grid of the world. That's then mapped onto static objects as well as dynamic objects. So in this case, this is the same sequence, but seen from the viewpoint of the internal computers of this car. So what you have here is it's tracking its location. It's using the Velodyne as well as the camera information to come up with ground plane estimates of where the obstacles are, of the grandstand here, the chute that it's kind of driving through. It's seeing the white line on the road. It's stopping there. It's then planning out a trajectory around this curved corner. It then has to pick out the appropriate lane, see the lane markings, and then it's able to drive and try to avoid any of these objects in the way, right? So this is how we build these systems in terms of using the sensor information, fusing all the different sensor information, building an internal representation of where the robot is, building maps, planning trajectories, and then actually sending that to the motor controllers to do this task. All right. Here's an actual more interesting case where now you have other agents in the environment. So in this case, this was you know, the robot car coming up behind a human-driven car. It senses that, of course, slows down, queues up behind the human-driven car in this four-way intersection. So the human driver goes through this four-way intersection. It comes up to and senses the white line on the marking for this intersection, stops, and then the rules of the road are encoded in these higher level state machines. So at this point, it's detected that there's another vehicle in the four-way intersection before this car has gotten there. So it's waiting for this other robot car to traverse the intersection. But in this case, that robot car had a software bug, so it's not moving. And so the rules of the competition then said after 45 seconds, you're allowed to go out of turn. But during this time, I think it's Cornell's robot tried to illegally pass this stuck robot. So after 45 seconds, this is our robot, makes a right-hand turn, gets past this stuck robot, and when we see this is Cornell's robot coming to us in the wrong lane, right, going the wrong direction. So we stop, right, he's blocked, and you see these human drivers are going, these robots just don't know where they're going. The human driver backs up, that gives enough clearance to actually go into a pass maneuver. So now the robot goes into a pass maneuver, cuts back in the lane, and then continues driving, right? So this is all done kind of autonomously if you can do the proper state estimation, planning, decision making, all layered together in this kind of in this type of fashion. All right. Okay, so what I want to now do is build upon some of the examples here and talk about how we can apply machine learning to some of these different subproblems. So the first thing I want to get into is thinking about using vision for this type of task, and then using online learning to help us bootstrap this type of visual odometry that could be used for this kind of driving task. So, and this is joint work with one of my students, Boram Lee, and with Kostas Daniladis, who's another faculty member at Penn. And here are the basic ideas. Instead of using all the LiDARs, can you do this kind of driving and estimation tasks of the ground and the objects using just, say, a single camera, right? Would you be able to mount your cell phone on your dashboard and basically have your cell phone drive your car? Okay? And the way then you have to then perceive the world, of course, is from kind of the image pixels that you get from your camera. You have to first figure out both your motion, your ego motion of the car moving, as well as the surrounding structure of the environment. And the way you do this, of course, this is conventional computer vision techniques, is you use multiple view geometry. So the basic idea is you're trying to do stereo, but not stereo simultaneously with multiple cameras, but you're using kind of stereo across time, right? And so what you want to do then is you have these features in the images, some sparse set of features that we're tracking. These features move as you move. Then what you can then do is essentially triangulate the depth of each of these individual features as you have these different observational points of view. Okay? And the way you then do this is you use epipolar geometrical constraints to basically write down a relationship between the location of the feature in one frame of the image, one frame of the video with the location in another frame. And then you can then solve for this to give you basically the relative rotation and translation of the viewpoints. That gives you your ego motion, and then you can also then solve for the depth of that point. All right? So this is what you want to do, is to try to learn the structure of the world using visual odometry. And then what you have to then do for driving is you also use some prior information about the structure of the world. In the case of autonomous driving, one clear cue that you need to use is that you have kind of a nice ground plane in front of the car. All right? So you want to use that information in a conjunction with these tracked features to kind of give you a very robust, efficient estimate of this surrounding world and motion. All right? And so you can use different types of models. For example, you could have a very simple kind of just a flat ground plane assumption in front of the car. If you want to get a little more sophisticated, you could add a couple more parameters to describe the tilt of the ground plane. You could also maybe model the curvature, say, of a road by adding a few more parameters to give you kind of a small number of degrees of freedom that describes how the ground should basically behave in front of the vehicle. All right? Now, the idea then is you've tracked all these little multiple points in your video, in your image, and now you want to extract from that something like this flat ground plane or some curved ground plane from this tracked set of points. And the way we do this robustly, and this is again a standard computer vision technique, is something called the RANSAC algorithm, right? Random sampling and consensus algorithm. And the basic idea is the following. I'm going to simplify, instead of just thinking about kind of two-dimensional points, let's just think about what happens to, as you drive, the set of features in kind of one dimension. and kind of how they move in the image plane, this velocity. Okay, so the inverse depth of a point and the velocity of some flat flat ground in front of the vehicle will basically have a linear relationship between this inverse depth and how much it moves in the camera. All right. Now you have many other points in the environment, because many points that you're tracking are, other cars maybe, or other trees and bushes. And so the basic problem here is, for you to estimate the ground plane in front of this vehicle, you have to find the dominant line in this scattered set of points. Okay. And of course, the standard line fitting algorithm, if you use something like least squares to do this, it would not work at all, because you have so many outliers in this type of data. Right? So the standard algorithm is this random sampling consensus, and here's the basic idea. I take 2 points just randomly from this set of points. I fit a line between these 2 points, and I count the number of inliers, that is, other points that are close to this line. And I do this again. So I might pick 2 other points in this random set, and then I fit a line through there, and then count the number of inliers. And then hopefully at some point you might pick this random point and this random point. You fit a line through here, and then suddenly you see that there's many, many inliers, and that's the dominant line in this set of points. Okay, that's the standard algorithm. Okay, but the problem here is, you see that as you have lots of outliers, it's very difficult to do the sampling efficiently enough that you can find this dominant line. So the idea that Boram was doing here was to leverage this with online learning, in the sense that instead of just using this geometrical information, can we incorporate learning some sort of appearance-based features to help with the ransack algorithm? So the basic idea is that you're going to use epipolar constraints and geometry to try to learn structure here. But on this side, you can now use an online learn classifier based upon the color and texture of those points to try to bootstrap this structure determination part by basically learning from structure in previous frames, learning something that helps us find ground points faster, and then scoring the probability of those ground points to help us with actually determining the structure. So now you're going back and forth between geometry and appearance through this online learning phase. Right? And the basic idea then is, this classifier that you learn will basically give some sort of probability. So think about something even simple as a naive Bayes classifier. It's going to score different points that you observe according to the probability that it could be consistent with things that were on the ground in previous frames. And then use that probability to actually now do something called a weighted ransack. Right? This is a very simple idea. Instead of taking all the points, instead of uniformly sampling these points, sample the points according to the learned online classifier. That will then bias your sampling towards basically sampling points along this line rather than sampling outlier points like here. And then you can then do the ransack in the same way, but you do it much more efficiently, and you can do it in much better real time than what you did in previous with the uniform sampling. Okay? So that's a basic idea, and a simple idea of using machine learning to help you with this with this visual odometry problem. And this is what it looks like, right? So if you apply that to a benchmark data set, this is the KITTI data set, you're tracking, using geometry, these points. You're learning which points are consistent with the ground plane. Given those points, you then start to learn the colors and textures of appearance of points that are consistent with the ground plane. You then use those scored probabilities here to find where things could be on the ground. And you see that it adapts then to the different lighting changings. And then you now combine these two to basically keep track of the ground plane in a much more robust and efficient manner. Okay, so that's the kind of idea, and being able to incorporate some simple online learning with this kind of perceptual task. All right? Okay, so the next thing I want to tell you about is taking now from learning from perception to learning in some sort of motion planning. Okay? And the basic idea here was developed, I have a couple students, Paul Vernazzo, who was actually here as a postdoc for a while, and then a new PhD student, Jinuk, who's been working on this. So the basic idea is the following, right? You might have a high-dimensional system. In the case of what we had on our humanoid robots, right? The configuration space of our humanoid robots is we have 1 degree of freedom for, say, the wrist. We have a degree of freedom for the elbow. We have 2 degrees of freedom for the shoulder. If you're considering your body motions, you might have a couple more degrees of freedom for each hip joint. You have, degrees of freedom for your leg joint. And so the configuration space of this, right, is very simply just the set of joint angles of all the different joints on the robot at a single time. All right? And what you want to now do is figure out how to plan trajectories in this configuration space. And so the basic idea with high dimensional planning is in your configuration space, you have some sort of initial configuration, you have some final desired configuration, and you need to figure out how to move all your angles so that you can get from your initial state to your final state without, say, colliding into things or having high costs. So here's a simple example, right? I want to plan out for my hand. Let's say my arm is starting from this initial pose, and I want to grab this water bottle. Then I have to plan out a trajectory in this configuration space that moves my hand out, across, around the table, avoiding collisions to pick up this water bottle. That's what's represented by this path. Okay? So what is the standard techniques to do this type of planning? Well, it's a high dimensional space, so what you might want to do is you don't want to keep you typically don't use you sample the space. Okay, so here's the basic idea of a RRT algorithm, rapidly exploring random tree. This is Steve Laval and James Kuffner's work. Is you basically sample points in your high dimensional space. You then try to find connected paths in this high dimensional space that take you from your initial condition to your final condition. And you do this in this kind of branching tree method, right? And so here's the kind of an actual example of this kind of arm planning task with an RRT. Is you might have regions where you're going to have collisions here. You want to then move from, say, some initial pose to this other final pose up here in this kind of collision-free manner. All right? So one way that we can actually use a simple learning algorithm to help us with this task is to improve the efficiency of RRTs. Now, the biggest bottleneck typically with these types of systems is actually the collision checking. Right? Every time I generate a new configuration, what you do typically is you have some perceived sensor data. You got to check for self-collisions. That is, you have some geometrical model of your arm. You want to see if your configuration is kind of hitting yourself or if the configuration is hitting some part of the environment. So every time you generate a new sample, you have to kind of do this collision check. Right? So one approach that we try to do for this kind of sample-based method is actually learn a generative model of collisions by basically using your full collision checker as a training examples to learn a model of which points in configuration space are actually the ones in collision, and then use your generative model to kind of prune away things that you don't need to check or that you want to bias your RT away from. And this is a simple example of using an incremental EM algorithm to learn a mixture of Gaussians in this high dimensional configuration space to learn kind of the set of points that are in collision to basically you can speed up an RRT by basically 5 to 10 times as fast as the original RRT, doing just basically improving the collision check. And we found that a lot of times for these problems, the collision checking part of the algorithm takes up 80% of the actual computation time. So if you can reduce any part of the collision check, that really helps reduce the actual planning task itself. Okay? Now that's using still the sampling-based planner, but the problem still with sampling-based planners is something called the curse of dimensionality. When you're in a high dimensional space, you're not finding optimal paths by just doing this kind of random sampling. And here's an example of this. Is we use a kind of RT type of based planner. And we're using, this is an old experiment that we did on a PR2 robot where we're trying to figure out the plan to move the arm from inside one of these windows into another window. What you see a lot of times is a very spurious types of path. And so what you see here is an example of the sampling-based planner. It pulls out, it's doing some very funky motions because the random sample that it picked in this high-dimensional configuration space is kind of has some weird orientations. And so even with smoothing, because you get some weird topologies coming out with this random sampling, you're going to get some very kind of not optimal paths. So one of the approaches that we advocated was not to do sampling, right? So let's think about the problem in the original continuous space. We're trying to find trajectories in this kind of high-dimensional vector space. We have some cost function that represents, say, the inverse speed of the motion, right? So if you're in collision, you can't move, so the speed of motion is 0. That means the cost is kind of infinity. Whereas some other areas maybe you have to move slowly, and other areas you can move quickly. And so you have a cost function. And then what you can then describe is, by a Lagrangian function, the actual time that it takes for you to move from some initial configuration here, right? So starting from some initial configuration state to the final configuration state, through this kind of space with these costs, you can describe by this Lagrangian function. Okay? Now, we want to keep it in this continuous domain, and the way you actually solve this problem, if you know anything about kind of finding optimal trajectories, is dynamic programming. And the way you do dynamic programming on this is you define a value function, and so we want to minimize, find the optimal path through this kind of cost function. We have then a value function v, which is related to the original cost function. The value function is related to this cost function through something called the iconal equation. This is a nonlinear partial differential equation that describes how the cost function is related to the value function for a continuous domain. All right? So this is actually the analog of Bellman's equation, but in a continuous space. Rather than in a kind of a discrete graph space, we're doing it with a continuous space. And so then the optimal trajectory, right, the fastest trajectory you can get is just gotten by basically going down the direction of steepest gradient, the steepest descent of your value function. Okay? And you can calculate these types of value functions in low dimensional spaces using a fast Marthing method. This is James Sethian's work, and shows kind of you can do some sort of dynamic program to calculate this value function if you need on a grid. Okay? So here's the analogy that we have. We're trying to make an analogy between this motion path planning problem and actually a physical problem called in optics. And in optics, we have the idea that you have a cost function. The cost function in optics is the local index of refraction. That is, the index of refraction describes kind of the inverse speed that light can travel through that region of space. Then the actual trajectory that the light takes is described by Fermat's principle of least time, which is exactly minimizing the Lagrangian function that I showed you before. So basically, tracing light rays, if you do graphics, through refractive media is equivalent to optimizing the principle of least time if you think about it in terms of motion control. All right? Now, the nice thing about these types of systems, these types of physical systems, is we can use some mathematics to try to simplify the problem. And the key theorem here is Noether's theorem. It was discovered by Emmy Noether, a nice woman mathematician. And what she described is that if you have the situation that your Lagrangian function has something like a continuous symmetry, then all continuous symmetries of the Lagrangian have something related to it called a momentum. Okay? And this is what allows us to simplify the problem if we have a certain type of symmetry in the Lagrangian function. So the idea here is that suppose my Lagrangian function has some sort of shift invariance to the function. Then what that means is any type of shift invariance is related to a conserved linear momentum in my path. Now this is what you use, this is what you learn in physics to actually solve hard problems. So for instance, when you learned in high school physics how to solve the ballistic motion of a rock being thrown in 3 dimensions, the way you learned to solve this problem was that there are 2 directions where momentum is conserved, right? In the horizontal direction, there's a symmetry to the problem, so linear momentum is conserved. So the only interesting direction that you solve this physics problem is in the z direction where momentum is not conserved. That is where you don't have this kind of invariance. And so what you do is you solve for the motion in the z direction, and then you use the conserved momentum to actually lift this one-dimensional trajectory back into the 3-dimensional full trajectory space, and that's the solution to this type of problem. Okay? So this is, and this occurs in optics as well, right? When you have basically an index of refraction, and it has a certain type of symmetry to it, so maybe in certain directions it's a constant. Then you have this conserved quantity, which is this conserved momentum. And this is actually the same as Snell's Law that you learned in optics, right? And so in Snell's Law, what you learned was that if I draw a diagram like this where I have one index of refraction up here and I have another index of refraction down here, then I have a translational symmetry to my index of refraction in this direction. And that results in a conserved momentum, which is basically the statement of Snell's Law between what happens of the trajectory in the upper half of this diagram and the lower half of this diagram. So what we can think about is what we just wrote down is a multidimensional generalization of Snell's Law, and now we're going to try to apply this to motion planning. All right? So the idea here is that we want to find, given our cost function, if we can find certain directions, this kind of symmetry to it, then we will have a value function which has this kind of rotational symmetry to it as well. And so we can take a high dimensional planning problem and basically convert that exactly into a low-dimensional planning problem by using these conserved momentums and solve it in the low-dimensional space and then lift the trajectories back into the high-dimensional space using these conservation laws. Okay? And the way we actually find these symmetries is now we can do some sort of spectral decomposition method. If you take a cost function and we look at the kind of associated gradients of this cost function, and then we kind of look at the matrix of these gradients, then we can actually do something like principal components analysis to identify which directions of this cost function have conserved symmetries and which ones don't. And then we can then use this to do this kind of analysis. So here's a simple example of an arm planning problem. So think of, yep.
Let's go ahead and do this.
Sure.
So I'm just trying to understand. You're finding symmetric quantities, in your Lagrangian, things that don't vary, problems that don't vary as you change certain variables around, and you're using a PCA of this constraint matrix. So I couldn't relate the two together.
Sure.
Do high eigenvalues correspond to the symmetric variables? Is it something as simple as that?
The smallest eigenvalues correspond to the ones that are more constant.
Okay, and why do small eigenvalues correspond to the
Because if I look at gradients, they're in the null space of the gradients. And so so you're looking for kind of directions which are in the null space of where the gradient vectors are. And that means that they're kind of constant in those directions, right? Because if they're perpendicular to the gradients, then that means that along those directions, the cost function doesn't change. And so we're finding these kinds of vectors where basically if I kind of move along those directions of the cost space, that the costs don't change. And that's the symmetry.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Okay? That's the idea. Okay, so for example here, we have a problem. We'll have something like an octopus arm, right? So here in this case, I forgot maybe 12 degrees of freedom. I have this arm, and it has to kind of move from, say, this initial configuration to some final configuration through these set of obstacles. Okay, that's like our motion planning problem. Now, as I said, this typical way you solve this is you work directly in this high-dimensional space. You sample these points and try to figure out if there's a connected path through from the initial state to the final state. Here, what I'm saying is that you do this spectral decomposition. You take this high-dimensional cost function as a function of the configuration space, and you learn some low-dimensional basically motions through this space. So this is kind of the top basis vector that we would learn, the second basis vector, and now we transform this high-dimensional planning problem into a two-dimensional problem, find a path in this two-dimensional space, and then lift the trajectory back into the whole arm space, the arm configuration space. Okay, so that's the basic idea, and this is how it looks like. So this on the right is a solution using this kind of low-dimensional decomposition. And on the left here is the RRT method in play. So you can see the difference here between being able to find paths using this kind of just a two-dimensional basis function of this arm versus what an RRT does in this high-dimensional space directly. Okay? And then we can actually take this kind of idea and apply it to the real robot. This is actually then arm planning using the PR2, using this kind of, again, just 2 or 3 dimensional basis set. And from a 7 degree of freedom arm, we're planning in this lower dimensional space using this fast marching method and then lifting these kind of nice smooth trajectories back up into the high dimensional space. Okay? So that's an example of how we use dimensionality reduction and actual mathematical theorems to prove that you can actually take what seems to be high-dimensional path planning problems and actually reduce it down into something that you can actually manage in a much more efficient manner. Yep?
So, should that cost matrix have to sample somewhere first?
Yeah, so you have to kind of get a set of samples of the cost matrix and then do this spectral analysis of it.
Presumably, you're only optimizing over where you thought we should care about.
Yeah. So in this case, what Paul did for his work was he basically sampled kind of just globally in this cost function space. But you could also do something iteratively, where you first sample a local region, plan, and then see where that goes, and then along the path of that plan, you can then take new samples, and so you can go back and forth between analyzing the cost gradients and then replanning based upon this kind of decomposition. So you can go back and forth and do it in an iterative manner if you want. Okay? All right, any other questions? Okay. Then I want to move on to motor control, right? So we talked about kind of machine learning and perception, machine learning and planning. One of the things I want to talk about here is doing some sort of reinforcement learning for legged locomotion. I know this is a hot topic for a number of you here. I was talking to Chris Atkinson the other day. So this is work by Sungjun Yi, who was a postdoc in my lab, Steve McGill, and then in collaboration with Dennis Hong, who provided the robots. So what we have here is we want to have the problem of bipedal locomotion. And what we need to then do to actually walk, right? This is if I want to walk fast with 2 legs, we need to do some sort of dynamic walk, right? The kind of simplest method is to do a static walk gait, right? The static walk would be essentially take your center of mass, put it above, when you're going on your left foot, you need to put it directly above your left foot, and then as you're kind of balancing on one leg, you would then move your right foot, put this right foot down, shift your center of mass above your right foot, and then statically walk with your left foot along like that. That's a static walk. It's too slow, so what you want to then do is figure out kinds of trajectories, dynamical trajectories that allow you to actually keep your balance even though you're not always over one foot during the single support phase. Okay? And the way you do this is you take this kind of very complex dynamical system and you reduce it down into a simpler dynamical system. And in this case, it's a inverted pendulum, linear inverted pendulum model, where when your foot is on the ground and you have your center of mass described by a point mass, then the condition that you need to satisfy is that the force, right, from your foot acting on your center of mass, there's 2 components. One is a normal force that fights against the weight of your mass, of your body. And then if this mass is actually accelerating along this line, then you'll have to generate a force that's proportional to the acceleration vector of that center of mass. So the resultant force of the foot acting on this point mass is the normal force with the acceleration force. That generates a force vector like this. And if this force vector is parallel to the vector connecting the foot to this mass, and that means that there's 0 torque around this foot. That's called the 0 moment point condition, and that's what's used to generate these kind of dynamic walks and these kinds of, originally from the Honda Asimo robot. Right? And so we can then solve this kind of condition. This gives us this linear partial differential equations, and you can solve those in time, and these generates the trajectories that are used to generate these kinds of, Honda Asimo walks that you've seen. Okay, that's the basic idea that's been used to do this. Now the problem with this is that this works nicely if you have a flat surface and you don't have any sort of external perturbations, right? But in real life, and this is our work in RoboCup, I know we've seen many former RoboCuppers, is that you never have no external perturbations, right? So this is an example of humanoid robot soccer. This is RoboCup with Manuela here. So what we have is our team here is the smaller robots. The larger team is these robots from a university in Japan. You see them fighting over the ball. They're bumping into each other. And then the ZMP stuff goes out the window, right? So when they're bumping into each other, they're trying to get up. They're getting each other's way. They can't keep upright because of that, right? So these perturbations really are bad, okay? So, and then you see then, this robot, our robot takes a shot. This is the goalie making this diving save. And then the problem with this is that you have limited sensing. So the Japanese goalie only has a camera in front of it. So when it gets up, the ball's sitting there. You can't see where the ball is. And then that gives enough time for us to walk in and kick the goal. So you can see that, this kind of bumping is really bad for this type of bipedal walking behavior. And the idea is, how do you actually compensate for this? And this is something that Ben Stevens here and Chris Atkinson worked on, is they looked at kind of what human strategies are to compensate for these pushes. So these are a couple of my students demonstrating this. So you have a number of strategies. One is an ankle strategy, where you basically counter torque around your ankles in response to a push. Another one is this hip strategy, where you use your upper body motion to basically compensate for the linear momentum. And another one is to do a capture step, so you recover the momentum in one step. Okay? So then you can write down some simplified controllers for this, right? So for ankles, it's like an inverted pendulum model. Hip dynamics, you can think about, when you're about to fall, you do this kind of thing. Suppose there's a ledge here. Sometimes when you're about to fall off the ledge, you do this. What's happening is you're converting linear momentum into angular momentum of your arms, and then you can slowly dissipate your angular momentum, and then you're now stable. That's the idea of a flywheel type of controller model. And then you have step dynamics, where you capture your momentum in the right directions. Okay? So then the idea was to use reinforcement learning techniques to actually modulate between these 3 different controllers. So you learn a higher level controller that can switch between these different behaviors. This is our work in simulation, where you take this robot physical model, you're bumping it, you're hitting it in different places. It now has to learn when to switch between an ankle controller, when to switch between a hip controller, and when to generate the appropriate step in response to these perturbations, right? So this is a policy gradient reinforcement learning applied to learning a policy that basically switches appropriately between these different types of behaviors. And then you can take that and put it on a real robot. And so this is actually our robot on the sled here, and it's learned to basically generate these behaviors in response to these different perturbations. Right, so here, and then you can also try to push it, and you see it using different types of strategies. This is a step strategy. In this case, right, so you're hitting it in different ways. This is a hip strategy, right, where you hit it from the front or from the side. It's able to take these compensator motions, right? And then you can then combine these things by, modulating these things at the appropriate time in the phase cycles, and so you can kind of see how it can respond to these different types of perturbations, okay? So this is using reinforcement learning to actually learn a better motor controller in response to these types of external pushes. All right? Okay, so I have 15 minutes left, so I wanted to now go a little bit more into a theoretical piece of work. And this is the idea of how we incorporate decision making in the presence of noise. This is some work with my postdoc Pedro Ortega, with a new student, Heejin, and with another faculty member, Alan Stalker. So first I want to contrast what we do in robotics in terms of decision making with what's known about decision making in animals. Okay? So this is some work, my friend Carlos Brody's lab at Princeton, and they did an experiment where they take rats and they train these rats to make these kind of left or right decisions, and they then try to analyze exactly how accurate the rats are at making these decisions. So in this task, what happens is that a rat is in this kind of cage, and it's hearing on the left ear a set of clicks, and on the right ear it's hearing another set of clicks. Okay? And what these clicks are generated are Poisson distribution kind of clicks. And the rat has to then figure out if the left side has a higher Poisson rate than the right side, and then it's going to have to then go to the left or right depending upon its decision. And if it's correct, it gets some reward. It gets an apple juice. If it goes to the wrong side, maybe it gets a shock. Right? This is how it learns how to do this. Okay? And so what they wanted to do is they trained these rats, and they wanted to see how efficient these rats were at doing this. Now, if you're a roboticist, this is a really simple task. Right? You make a robot, you put a left microphone, you make a right microphone, and the optimal kind of estimation theory tells you just count the number of clicks on the left, count the number of clicks on the right, find out which one's larger, and then basically move your head in that direction. Right? That's the way we would build an engineered system to do this. Now the rats don't do this, and the way they do this, there's a model for this in rats, and it's called a diffusion decision-making model. And the idea is that you have some decision variable, and it basically, for every time it hears a left click, it might jump up. Every time it hears a right click, it might jump down. And what the rat does is kind of integrate these clicks by this kind of noisy diffusion process. And then what happens is at some point this diffusion variable crosses either a lower threshold or an upper threshold. And so when it crosses that threshold, that's when the rat makes the decision to either move left or right. Okay, that's the model. And now what they try to do is fit this quantitatively to the animal data. And in order to do this, you have to use significant amounts of noise. That is, that rats are not like robots in doing this task. They actually are very noisy because this diffusion process is really noisy. And so they sometimes make what looks like random decisions. Okay? So the question is, why does biology seemingly have so much levels of noise in their decision-making process, whereas when we build a system, we think that we are making it so noise-free? So what's the difference between biology and what we do in terms of machines? And so I want to now go over a little bit about some theory behind decision-making. Right? So we're going to say, if you're going to build a machine that makes these decisions, how do we do it, right? So let's say that instead of 2 choices here, we can give you 3 choices, right? So you can either pick, this first object, an apple. You can pick the middle object, an orange. You pick or the third object, a banana. Now, when economists describe how you behave, one of the simple things that we can do is say that you behave according to some sort of utility function, right? That the utility to you of eating an apple might be 2.7 in terms of some units. Maybe you don't like oranges, so your utility is negative 0.4. And maybe you like bananas kind of in the middle, so that's a utility of 1.6. Okay? And so one simple theory is that in terms of behavior, you should just basically do things that maximize your utility. Right? This is kind of this basis of why you do expected reward, and you maximize expected reward when you learn about Markov decision processes. Right? So when you do this expected reward or expected utility maximization, what we can do is we can write down our strategy as a distribution over which objects we would pick. So I would either pick the first object, the second object, or the third object, or I could pick them with some sort of probability distribution, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, which would represent, in this probability simplex, the middle point. And we're trying to optimize over all probabilities what the expected utility is according to those measured utility values. Okay? And so what we then do is rational behavior is basically just maximizing this expected utility function over all probability distributions. Okay? And so what we then get is if we do this maximization, we get always a deterministic policy which tells us pick the object that has the best utility. That's the rational behavior that we're getting from this kind of model. Okay? And this is also why when you learn about Markov decision processes, you always learn that deterministic policies can always be optimal, so therefore you can only have to search through the set of deterministic policies when you learn about doing MDPs. Okay? Now, the issue is that we've seen that humans and animals don't seem to do this. And this, I'm happy to be speaking here in this hall because this was introduced by Herbert Simon, and he introduced this idea of bounded rationality that you can't explain things as animals or humans as working in perfect rational type of behavior. And the kind of image of this is the difference between how someone like Spock from Star Trek would behave versus someone like Homer Simpson, right? And we just had the Powerball lottery this past week, right? If you were Spock, you would never buy a ticket for the Powerball lottery because the expected value of you getting any winnings from that Powerball is negative, right? Whereas Homer Simpson would take his life savings and invest it in the lottery, right? This is the difference between these two behaviors. So how do we explain this type of behavior? I don't know. How many people here actually bought a ticket to the Powerball lottery? Okay, some of you. Maybe some of you don't want to admit it, but some of you bought a ticket. All right? So one model that's been kind of common, and this was work that Drew Bagnell worked on here, other people, Emo Todorov, Bert Kaplan, Tali Tishby, Daniel Braun, is actually modeling behavior using something called information theoretic bounded rationality. And the idea is that you optimize a function over actions, over your strategy, that includes this expected utility, this linear expected utility function, but you have another term which kind of regularizes things. And this regularization term is something like an entropy term. Okay? And the idea is that you maximize what looks like a free energy according to your actions, distribution over actions. Okay? Now what is this relative entropy? This relative entropy term is basically the Kullback-Leibler divergence between your strategy and some sort of default strategy Q. So for instance, maybe you always prefer, with 60% probability, to always pick the last item given to you. Maybe you are adverse to picking the middle item, so you only pick that 10% of the time in a default strategy, and maybe you pick the first item with 30%. So the idea then is that you have some sort of default strategy, and then you pay some sort of information cost of deviating from this default strategy that's according to your utility function. Okay? So then when you do this optimization of this free energy, you have a special parameter. This is the temperature parameter. And when you optimize over the free energy, you then get this kind of Gibbs distribution with this kind of inverse temperature parameter beta. And what you then get is this temperature tunes you. So if when the inverse temperature goes to 0, that is when you have high temperature, then your strategy becomes just your default strategy. So that means that you don't care about the actual utilities. You just are kind of randomly picking things according to some default policy. Okay? When this temperature goes to 0 or the inverse temperature goes to infinity, then you recover fully rational behavior where you always pick the maximum utility. Okay, so this temperature variable kind of controls the amount of bounded rationality that you have. Okay? Now the question is, why do you even use this function? Okay? So the result that we have is that we have an interpretation of why you want to maximize this free energy function in terms of an optimal type of min-max game. That is, I can convert this maximization over this linear utility and this entropy function as a max-min over an auxiliary function that I call C, which then gives us this simple linear optimization in terms of the max, okay? And what we then interpret then is that we can say that you acting according to this bounded rational way is actually the optimal way to act in a game situation where the environment is adversarial, and it's adversarial because it's able to shift the utility function on you according to some of these costs. Okay? And the way we get this result is simple. It's actually just a Legendre transform. So if you know about Legendre transforms in optimization theory, this is how you can kind of write the duals of problems. In physics, this is how you go from kind of position space to momentum space representations. In statistical mechanics, this is how you go from pressure to volume in terms of your free energy functions. And the basic idea is that you take any arbitrary function here, and you can rewrite that as an optimization according to some sort of linear function of that variable. Okay? And so that's the basic idea. And then what you can show then is this Legendre transform takes this relative entropy term and turns it into this kind of actual costs. Okay? And so this is the convex conjugate of the KL divergence that we're using. Right? And so this is what it means. It means that when we want to play this kind of game, I'm trying to figure out a strategy P that optimizes my observed utilities minus what the environment can kind of adversarially shift on me. And the environment is kind of against me by shifting it against what I would like to choose. And so my actual utility is kind of decremented by what the adversarial environment puts on place. Okay, so the picture you should have then is the following. I'm trying to choose between the apple, the orange, and the banana. These have kind of utilities, like an apple has a utility of 2.7, the orange has a utility of negative 0.4, and the banana has a utility of 1.6. But the environment can kind of add worms to these different fruits. And so if I'm always picking the apple, then an adversarial environment will going to put all its worms on your apple. Okay? So the best optimal thing that you can do is not to kind of concentrate on one item, but spread your choices among these different items according to this Gibbs distribution. And that's actually optimal against this kind of adversarial type of scenario. Okay? And so you can then show that, you know, this is exactly what happens. You have this kind of mini-max game. If you're trying to choose one of the items deterministically, the environment will kill you on that choice. So the best thing to do is basically spread according to this Gibbs distribution so that you become basically agnostic to the item that you get. Okay? And then from optimization theory, you can show that this problem, Kullback-Leibler divergence, is convex. So that basically by doing this Legendre transform, you get a dual formulation. So you can switch the max and the min operations, min-max. There's zero duality gap if you know about optimization theory. And so you can then show nice results about the properties of this solution. So here's the basic idea that you have a Gibbs distribution. This is actually the optimal thing. It's kind of the rational strategy if you assume that the environment is adversarial against you in this fashion. Okay? And then the question is, how do you generate this Gibbs distribution? So you learn all about Monte Carlo sampling techniques and all these kinds of fancy things. But here's a simple mathematical way of generating Gibbs distribution. And here's the idea. You take a special type of random variable. It's called the Gumbel distribution. The Gumbel distribution is interesting. It's basically, if you want to do it in MATLAB, take a uniform distribution and take the negative log of the uniform distribution and then take another negative log of that. That will generate something called a Gumbel random variable. It has the following probability distribution function. And the interesting thing is that the Gumbel distribution in mathematics is something called a max stable distribution. It's the analog of the Gaussian. The Gaussian is a sum stable distribution. That is, if I take any kind of infinite distributed random variable and I take a large number of sums of this is the central limit theorem, you get a Gaussian. If, however, I take a random variable and I take a large number of these and I take the max of it, I will get a Gumbel distribution in the asymptotic limit. And so it's a max stable distribution. And what you can then show is you can generate a Gibbs distribution by basically adding a Gumbel random variable, noisy random variable, to the observed utility functions, and then taking the argmax of the noisy version of that utility. That will actually generate the Gibbs distribution. So what this means is that we can actually think about some interesting scenarios where you might want to generate an optimal strategy in an adversarial environment by adding a certain type of noise and then basically doing, instead of maybe doing a sum operation, can do a max operation in your accumulator function, and this will automatically generate this kind of this type of behavior. All right? And then we can, I don't want to have too much time now, so you can generate this in kind of a multi-arm bandit setting. You can kind of do a lot of theory in terms of how you actually learn the observation, how you actually learn the nature of the environment. So the main point here is that your optimal policy for your robot really depends upon what the environment is. If the environment is just stochastic, you should do deterministic things. If the environment is actually adversarial, you should actually do some sort of kind of stochastic policies like this. And so the question is, how can the robot actually, from the observed distribution of rewards in response to their actions, actually determine the level of adversarialness in the environment? And this is an algorithm that we also worked on in terms of having the robot determine that automatically. All right? So at this point, I wanted to conclude. We have here, the opportunity with all these new types of hardware, sensors, actuators. We have these new types of robots. The demand for kind of robust real-time algorithms that can handle all these types of uncertainties is really key. And I showed you a little bit of how we can explain learning and low-dimensional representations to do this task. And I think a key area for the future direction of work is really how you account for human behaviors and adversarial situations. So for instance, the field of human-robot interaction, right? When we build a robot, one of the things that you might want the robot to do is to really understand whether the human that it's working with is kind of helping it, is cooperative, or if the human is a Luddite and is trying to harm the robot, right? It's very adversarial. So how do you get the robot to even understand the nature of the human being that they're interacting with? So these are important questions that I think that need to be fundamentally addressed before we can really think about really building kind of robust systems. Okay, so finally, I just want to acknowledge some of the people on these pictures are here, actually. All the students and collaborators that we've had over the years in doing these projects. Thank you very much for your attention.
We have time for a question or two. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
So Dan, what do you think about, you're talking about representations that make it easy to learn these things in the early part of your talk especially. How about systems learning representations themselves? Obviously people can do that, they can start, they have something coded, but you can learn representations. Is that in the cards for being able to do it?
That's a great question. So the question is, how do you automatically learn, say, a low-dimensional representation that you can use?
There's some insight that goes into choosing that low-dimensional based on the designer point.
Yeah, we had done some previous work on trying to do some sort of manifold learning algorithms that would learn some of these internal representations automatically depending upon kind of the observed correlations in your sensor data. But it's still pretty difficult. So a lot of, like right now, so for instance, this driving task. Just the human prior knowledge that you should be looking for some sort of ground plane in front of you is a big thing that, I don't know if we would automatically learn that right now from the data itself. So you're right, though, but in general, it'd be nice if there are good, robust techniques that would kind of build good internal representations where maybe human knowledge is not adequate. And then we would want to be able to do that in this kind of learned fashion. But yeah, definitely it's a ripe area of research for the future.
Anyone else? Oh, thank you.
All right, thank you.